Well, kia ora koutou. Good afternoon from Auckland. I'm Murray Bruce. I'm the director of the Helen Clark Foundation. Welcome to today's webinar, Exploring the Australian-New Zealand Relationship in 2025. Before we jump into today's webinar, to note, we've got an exciting range of webinars planned in the coming weeks, including on junk food and obesity, and on New Zealand's nuclear-free policy 40 years after the Rainbow Warrior bombing, as well as on social cohesion with economist Shamibio Jakob. Some of our coming webinars will be available only to members of our foundation. So if you'd like to hear more conversations like today and to support the work of our foundation in developing solutions to New Zealand's pressing long-term challenges, we'd love to have you as a member. Membership fees are currently only 65 if you're waged and 35 if you're a student or retired. So now would be a great time to join, and you can do that on our website or via the link that my colleague Victoria will shortly post into the chat. So to today's webinar. First up, our customary reminder that this is a webinar, not a normal Zoom call, so you can eat your lunch, drink your coffee, safe in the knowledge that your cameras and microphones are deactivated and cannot be seen or heard. But we do hope you'll participate in the webinar. And the best way to do that is by submitting questions for our panelists into Zoom's Q&A function, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. You can do this whenever a question occurs to you throughout the webinar, and you can also vote on other people's questions. And I will then put your questions to our guests at around about the 12:40 mark. You'll also see there's a separate chat function. We'll put links in there from time to time, but please put your questions for the panelists in the Q&A area. And then finally, please let us know what you thought of this webinar by filling in the feedback form that should appear in your browser and or in your inbox. It's a 2-minute process, and it really helps us design webinars that you, our viewers, want to see. So this will be our third webinar of 2025, looking at geopolitics and global affairs and what it all means for New Zealand, reflecting, I think, what is pretty clearly a turbulent moment around the globe. Today, we're looking a little closer to home and at our closest neighbour and most important international partner. Put simply, there is no other country that matters more to New Zealand than Australia. Geographically, culturally, economically, and politically, we're not the same, but we are inextricably linked. What happens in Australia, therefore, matters greatly to us here in New Zealand, to our government as it makes foreign policy and sometimes domestic policy decisions, to our companies, large and small, who export goods and services across the Tasman, to our second largest two-way trade partner in Australia, to the many and growing number of New Zealand citizens who live in Australia, and to our neighbours in the Pacific, with whom we have a shared interest in maintaining a stable and prosperous region despite climate change and changing geopolitics. Yet for all that, Australia doesn't always get the same airtime in the national conversation that some larger countries in the region do. And there is a risk that we don't understand our closest partner as well as we think we do, or as well as we should. So to help bring us up to date with key developments in Australia and what they mean for New Zealand, we're delighted to be joined today by 3 esteemed guests, and Dame Annette King, Stephen Jacoby, and Jeremy Dicker. As it happens, all former diplomats, but each come from different backgrounds and have taken different career paths, and each are extremely well placed to provide insights on the politics, foreign policy, and economy of Australia in 2025. Jeremy Dicker is a former Australian diplomat who's now managing editor at Intrigue Media, a media startup founded by ex-diplomats, providing over 125,000 subscribers around the world with a free daily geopolitics briefing. Jeremy started his career in the United Nations in Fiji before serving 14 years in the Australian Foreign Service with tours to Mexico, Peru, and the United States, where he was my Australian counterpart when I was a New Zealand diplomat based in Los Angeles. Great to see you again, Jeremy.
Thanks,
the Honourable Dame Annette King will be known to most of our viewers today. She was New Zealand's High Commissioner to Australia from December 2018 through December 2023. Before this role, she served as Deputy Leader of the New Zealand Labour Party and Deputy Leader of the Opposition from 2008 to 2011, and again from 2014 to 2017. She was a senior cabinet minister in the 4th and 5th Labour governments with a wide range of ministerial portfolios, including justice, health, police, immigration, and transport. And having spent over 30 years in Parliament, she holds the record as New Zealand's longest-serving female MP. And Stephen Jacoby currently serves as New Zealand Director for the Australian-New Zealand Leadership Forum, which brings business, government, together to create prosperity, security, and stability for both countries. A former diplomat and trade official, Stephen has led both the New Zealand-US and the New Zealand-China councils, as well as the APEC Business Advisory Council. Stephen is the outgoing Executive Director of the New Zealand International Business Forum and the Managing Director of Geopolitics Consulting Limited. So I don't think we could have three better placed panelists today to comment on the Australia-New Zealand relationship in 2025. So thank you all for being here. Just before we start, I'd also like to acknowledge Sarah Bell, a former colleague of Annette's, Stephen's and mine in the New Zealand Foreign Ministry, and now the Helen Clark Foundation's very own Australia expert. So thank you, Sarah, for leading the design of the webinar, which she would have participated in today, but for a cold. So to our first question, which I'll put to Jeremy and Annette, could we, so perhaps first to you, Jeremy, could we please start with some high-level reactions to the Australian election results only 2 months ago now, although much has happened in the world since. What happened in the election? How surprising was the outcome? How do you see the importance of domestic factors versus international factors in the outcome?
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks, Murray. I mean, it was a surprise and it wasn't, depending on how you want to look at it. I mean, it was a surprise in the sense that polls were consistently saying it was going to be a bit of a photo finish, a close call. The Conservative opposition looked like it might even, be in the lead at one point. But then, we all went to bed that Saturday night in May, and not only had our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese from our Labour Party, not only had he won, but he'd done so in a thumping win, giving his party a historic majority in Parliament, pretty much double, more than double the Conservative opposition. And to top it off, the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, lost his own seat, which no one really saw coming. So, very quickly, that's sort of what happened. I think when you kind of zoom out, though, and look at what really happened, I think it would be inaccurate to suggest that that was a passionate endorsement of the Albanese government. If you look at the primary vote, that's, the number of Australians who put the Labour Party as number one. It was still, like 34%. So like really, really pretty low. And the Liberal Party, our Conservative Party, was 32%. Where the blowout really happened was in the preferences, which I think suggests that people didn't want to necessarily give a ringing endorsement for the Albanese government, but they didn't want to change sides either. And so, that kind of all flowed through our complicated preferences system to kind of accurately capture the democratic vibe of the Australian people at the moment. And that's what's got us here today. So I guess looking forward, Anthony Albanese is a veteran of Australian politics. He's popular personally. People like him. He has a kind of folksy charm and has a long history of engaging respectfully and with compassion across the party line. But folks aren't necessarily happy with how his first term went, and they want to see him use his historic majority to really start fixing some of the concrete problems that folks are feeling, things like housing affordability, cost of living, and so on. So that's my kind of initial quick take. I'd love to hear how Annette saw things from her perch as well.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. I think I agree with just about everything you said. But I was here for the 2019 election, the miracle one. And what I learned being here for 3 elections now, that polling accuracy has improved, but it still has quite a long way to go. And as you said, they were basically saying it was too close to call, or maybe a little majority with a coalition type government for Albanese and so on. And I decided that I would hand out how to vote cards on election day, a great experience as a New Zealander, because you certainly can't hand out all that propaganda at the polling booths. But I have to say, standing there and handing out for Fiona Phillips, who was in the most marginal seat in the House of Reps in the seat of Gilmore, that I could not have been able to tell what the election result was going to be. People would walk straight past you. If they were Labour, they'd definitely take one of your cards. But I at the end of it, I did have no idea. And in the end, she had a huge swing, a huge majority. So I think that they're going to have to do a lot of work on polling if you're going to believe what they say. But I think there are a number of factors that affected it. Jeremy, I don't know whether you agree, but certainly the rise of independents and minor parties makes it really hard for pollsters to be able to see what's happening. And also, I think they have made some methodological changes, and maybe they need to make some more of those. But one thing that I noticed was the late campaign, the last week of the campaign, where it just seemed to be a real upswing in interest in Labour and Labour policies. And I think that probably confused the pollsters as well. So, it was a huge victory, a massive victory, but you're right about the percentage of actual party vote. And it's such a strange system with the, with the two-party preferred you've got to look at. But what interested me, and I'd be interested in Stephen's view on this as another Kiwi, the voter turnout was 90.7%. 90.7%. And I looked at the voter turnout for New Zealand in the last election, and we're down in the 70s, 70, 74 or something. And I'm going to be controversial here. I think it's time we had compulsory voting, especially with the attack that's on democracy at this moment and how important it is that people vote. And it might be a donkey vote, some of that, Jeremy, but because of the system mainly. But I think that a turnout of over 90% compared to and the falling turnout in New Zealand, even at a time of a high popularity of a party, I think it's time to rethink things.
That's a really great point. I would, maybe if I could just squeeze in before we hear from Stephen, one of the things I love about our compulsory voting, and it's always surprised me that our cousins across the ditch don't have compulsory voting, because we share a lot of similarities in so many other ways. But I think compulsory voting is a wonderful antidote to the rise of populist politics, because instead of appealing to your base to try and get the vote out, like you want people to turn up on election day, well, everyone's going to turn up because they've got to. And so it shifts the conversation a little bit more to, well, how are we going to fix these problems? So yeah, but didn't mean to interrupt. I'd love to hear Stephen.
Well, kia ora koutou katoa, and great pleasure to be with you all today. And, compulsion clearly has a place, doesn't it? Because we see the difference in voter turnout. Of course, here in New Zealand, we had thought that maybe the introduction of our MMP system would have given, rise to greater confidence in politics and encouraged more people to be involved. It doesn't really seem to have done that so much, although it has certainly created greater diversity, in our parliament. And I think that it's good that we look at all of these things from time to time. Of course, clearly in New Zealand, we're going through a period of reflection about whether we should have a 4-year parliament or not. That's a debate that maybe we'll be having as the year unravels. But we clearly do have to do something to address this loss of confidence in the political system and find ways to bring, that closer to the needs of everyday voters.
Thanks, Stephen. Why don't we stick with you to respond first to this question, and then I'll ask Annette and Jeremy to respond as well. What do you think are the major domestic priorities and challenges for Prime Minister Albanese in this new term, including on big issues like the economy, like climate change, and if you want to also reflect on what Labour's re-election might mean for New Zealanders and Australia as well. So, question to all, but starting with you, Stephen.
Yes, well, I mean, it's clearly there's no shortage of challenges, but in the international economy, and what a week we've just been through, for goodness sake, and who knows how all this is going to continue to unravel. But it seems, and I'd be interested obviously in others' views, but it seems that priority in terms of policy in Australia is moving a little beyond just coping with the impact of the cost of living crisis. I mean, obviously still very important to Australians as it is to New Zealand, but turning attention more to looking at issues around productivity and competitiveness of the whole economy. And that is of interest to us because it aligns with our own government's focus on going for growth. And it could open up some new avenues for cooperation. Of course, if it's successful in Australia, it could also mean that Australia becomes even more attractive for large numbers of New Zealand citizens who want to have a future in that economy. But I think the key point in all of this, and it leads on from our earlier discussion, is that the Albanese government now has a very strong electoral mandate. And it is going to be able to think about doing things that may not have been achievable before, although actually if you think of similar very strong mandates we'd have in New Zealand, it can sometimes work in the other way, because the fear of losing the mandate can sometimes create a sort of problem that politicians then have to deal with. But in any way, both Australia and even here in New Zealand are now some way off from an election, and that opens a very interesting window because it gives rise to thinking about things that we could do together. And we need to use this window to best effect. And that's going to be very much on the mind of the Australia-New Zealand Leadership Forum when it meets in Canberra for the very first time, by the way, in September of this year. The forum is a place where we bring together, high-level government and high-level business people and other stakeholders to think about the future of the relationship. And I think this one's a very critical one. We're having it in Canberra deliberately to be in the face of Australian government and Australian ministers. It's going to be held at Old Parliament House. We'll be actually looking at them. It's been described as the ultimate symbol of New Zealand and Australian togetherness. And as I say, in this unique moment for both governments, I think it's going to be quite powerful.
I have to say that in this last while, the real focus in Australia has been on defence policy because of what's happening internationally, but also the huge cost of defence for Australia and the Australian budget. And so it has dominated the news, defence, and it continues to do so. But Stephen, I did note that there were a number of issues that the new government set out that they were going to focus on, and productivity certainly was one. And Jim Chalmers made that clear very early on, bringing down inflation and providing relief for the cost of living, and also paying conditions for low-paid workers, those sorts of things. But they also said they wanted a national AI capability plan. They were looking, and I mentioned defence, but also expecting to spend a lot more time in Southeast Asia on trade and investment. And that's something I'm sure we'll be very interested to be working alongside them. And of course, critical minerals, of which we have very few, but they have plenty, that they do intend to have a focus on that policy. And of course, the last one, housing, which is one that we share, but also energy policy, and the huge debate there has been around energy policy in this country. And perhaps with that mandate that Labour has got, maybe they'll be able to secure a longer term plan than the flip-flops that happen every 3 years, whether they're going to have a proper climate change policy or not. And I think the new leader of the opposition, Susan Lee, is certainly has a problem there in terms of the issue, but it looked to me as if she was prepared to confront the issues, because we haven't talked about why they failed, but perhaps we'll find out more about what they think the reasons are when they finish their review.
I would just to drill down on one of those issues, possibly the biggest one on the minds for a lot of Australian voters, and possibly also the toughest one for any party to touch, is housing. Affordability is just really a tough issue right now. Our medium income to medium price ratio is 8-1, which is about double what any reasonable think tank would consider healthy. And it just seems to be getting worse. A core driver of that is our tax policy, which incentivizes investors to buy an increasing share of the housing stock in this country. But that's also what makes it so hard to unwind, because we have older generations who've got fabulously wealthy riding that housing boom, but it means younger generations are just priced out. The last time any prime ministerial hopeful tried to touch that policy was Bill Shorten in the miracle election. He was the wrong side of the miracle. Mm-hmm. He lost the unlosable election, and there are all kinds of reasons why that might have happened. But one was that he was, pledging to implement some of the tax reforms that might unwind that. Anthony Albanese, now that he has such a massive mandate in terms of numbers, not in terms of what he promised to do, he didn't say he would touch any of that tax policy. He could fix that with the mandate he's got. That would take a lot of political courage, and I think people would accuse him of, backflipping and breaking electoral promises. What he's doing instead is promising to boost supply. But that takes years, and it's got to be done in a really careful way, such that the existing tax incentives don't just mean that investors keep buying more of the new supply that comes online. It's a really tough one, and I do fear that it provides opportunity for more populist politicians to kind of seize the gap and promise more radical solutions. So I really hope our sensible middle in this country can come up with some good immediate answers.
Thanks, Jeremy. I think we'll stick with you for the next question, and then perhaps if Annette wants to weigh in on as well. I think it's clear to many New Zealanders that Australia is our most important partner across most spheres, number one or number two on economic security, and of course people-to-people ties. And I think most of us would intuitively understand we don't loom as large for Australia. But what place does New Zealand hold in the minds of Australian policymakers, and what do they see as New Zealand's role in Australia's objectives for the region and for the world?
Well, yeah, New Zealand does loom really large for Canberra and all policymakers. I was one of them as an Australian diplomat for 14 years. And I learned that in my very first year when I joined DFAT's graduate program. And sitting right next to me in our cohort of 40 or 50 junior diplomats was a Kiwi diplomat who was there as part of our annual exchange. And that's just one. I came to learn that there were like another couple dozen more Kiwi diplomats on exchange across DFAT and vice versa. And the same thing plays out across our defense ministries, our intelligence ministries, and beyond. So at that policymaker day-to-day level, it's just it's a really deep level of collaboration that is pretty obvious to any of us working in Wellington or Canberra. And maybe the challenge for us is to kind of sell that story a little bit more effectively out to folks, outside our capital cities. It goes beyond that though as well. Any climate forum, any APEC summit, OECD, COP. You could pick any summit where we're both participating. And, even, Murray and I were both diplomats serving in the US. No matter where we are, we work very closely together because, despite our occasional differences, we fundamentally share a lot of the same basic values and interests. And we're just constantly comparing notes. So, I think fundamentally, at the policymaker level, we work incredibly closely together. We work through whatever the issue is of the day, and there's always going to be issues. I just hope, we can all do a better job of making that story clearer to the folks outside. I know, our High Commission in Wellington, it's always led by a very, very senior Australian diplomat. Right now, it's Daniel Sloper. It was previously Harinder Sidhu and Ewan McDonald. These are our most senior Australian diplomats. And likewise, you've had former cabinet ministers like Annette representing New Zealand, Australia. So I don't think there should be any doubt about how we see each other at the policymaker level. And maybe there's more work we can do out selling that story a little better.
Great, thanks, Jeremy.
I always look at the Lowy poll each year to see just whether we maintain the top spot for how Australians think about New Zealanders. But interestingly, the Asia Pacific poll, was it, Stephen? The Institute's poll also has New Zealanders believe Australians are our best friends as well. So when the McKinsey Institute said there are no two countries closer on the planet, it doesn't mean we all agree with everything, but I found in my 5 years here that Australia and New Zealand are very close. We've got something like 80 supporting bilateral documents that covers everything from free trade of goods and services and a labour market, mutual recognition of goods and services, and certainly the changes, I think, that were made by the Albanese government after the last, not the most recent, but the last election, have been really significant in terms of New Zealanders living in Australia, and something that the MFAT in particular fought very hard for, to get changes made to the conditions and Kiwis who've lived here for a long time. And so those changes that were made, the direct pathway to citizenship which became effective from the 1st of July 2023, were really significant. I think someone said, well, that'll mean a lot more Kiwis who become dual citizens voting for Labour. I suspect that would be at the back of the mind of the government, but I would be interested to know if they do a breakdown where you've got a lot of Kiwis who've got citizenship out of Queensland, whether they do an assessment of what impact the number of New Zealanders who were in, say, Jim Chalmers' electorate, or maybe even Peter Dutton's electorate, who then got the right to vote before the last election. But we should not underestimate just how important those changes were, having had so much stripped from us from 2001 onward, and the tightening of the screws on New Zealanders over those years right up until those changes.
Thanks,
I mean, just to add, I think it's worth observing that we've got a really good thing going on here down in the South Pacific with Australia, and if you bear in mind the way we have achieved this over time and look at the difference that we have made, it is quite noticeable compared with the European Union and its attempts to create something similar, but through completely different mechanisms. And look at the rest of the world that's bringing up bridges and borders, and not bridges, walls and borders all over the place. But remember, though, one important thing that, at the end of the day, and despite all this good stuff, in many ways, Australia is more important to New Zealand than New Zealand is to Australia, and that means it's to do with the size of economies, it's to do with a whole lot of things. And that means we always have to work hard on this relationship, which is precisely why we put excellent people into Canberra and why we really welcome Australia putting such excellent people here in Wellington.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, I think it's a really good point. We have a good story here. I think we've seen maybe play out elsewhere among neighbors and allies, maybe where some of that has been taken for granted, and then there's an election and whoops, Canada and the United States are no longer friends. And so I think hopefully we can all learn from that lesson, and even though there's a good story, not take any of it for granted. I guess the other thing, Stephen, you make a really good point about there is some asymmetry there just in our size. But I guess fundamentally, one of the ways I think about this relationship is the fact that in terms of size, both of us are fundamentally price takers internationally, not price makers. So both of us fundamentally aren't big or strong enough to reshape our region and reshape our world however we like. And the way we do that is through an international system of laws and international institutions that we both fundamentally rely on being effective and credible. And so, at the end of the day, while we've got differences in size, we've got a pretty shared vision that we really need that system to survive. And it's under a lot of pressure right now. So, when I think about how we work together, that's in the big picture sense where I really see it playing out. We really need this world system to not just survive, but thrive.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Jeremy. I think it'd be a good time to turn back to you, Stephen, and perhaps to answer, I guess, a similar question to the one we've just addressed, but with respect to business in both New Zealand and Australia. I don't think there'd be too many people that understand the trans-Tasman business environment better than you. What is your sense of how New Zealand businesses look at Australia, and vice versa, how Australian businesses see New Zealand? How's that changing at the moment?
Well, I think in some ways we're really the victims of our own success. We've had 40 years of free trade under CER. That's actually my entire working lifetime. I started working for the government here in 1983. I'm that old, it's true. That's quite a major achievement. And the relationship that we have now reflects a high level of economic integration on both sides of the Tasman. The theory should be, and it was always the aim, that it should be just as easy to do business with Australia as it is to do business here in New Zealand, and vice versa. I think that's still somewhat of an aspiration, because the fact of the matter is we are different countries, we are different markets, our market structures are different. The business culture, while very similar, is also quite different in some quite in different ways. And trade between us is still important, but today investment is the real driver of the trans-Tasman economy. and it's more important with Australia than it is with any of our other partners. And I think emerging exporters in New Zealand sometimes look at Australia as maybe the easy first step. And they're often surprised when they get there and find it's actually not quite that easy. Doing business around the world is not easy anyway. But and similarly, Australians might think that New Zealand could be a bit of a light touch, and they come here and find that actually it's quite competitive, particularly with other free trade partners of New Zealand operating in this market. They could be tempted to overlook us because of our small size, but what often they find is a much bigger market opportunity than they thought. So, I mean, there are a lot of different dynamics coming into this relationship. I guess my one, takeaway from this is it's probably not as easy as some people think to do business in both countries, but it's certainly a lot easier than in many other parts of the world.
I have to say, Stephen, that I've been most impressed with NZTA's work, NZTE's work.
Yes.
That's the problem with being a former Minister of Transport. You get a bit confused. But NZTE's work in Australia and the Pacific, and how they have been able to assist a lot of trade across the Tasman. Make the point that you do. You just don't rock up to Australia and say, I'm here to do business, please deal with me. That you need to know the steps, you need to know the contacts, and NZT, I think, do a brilliant job of that in introducing New Zealand businesses into Australia. And that wasn't an advert for them, it was just what I saw.
Yeah, I think Stephen used the term victims of our own success, which is exactly how I describe it as well. It is so seamless. We already picked so much of the low-hanging fruit. I just had the experience the other day. I've got 2 young daughters who love jumping on a trampoline, and I needed a replacement part. It comes from a New Zealand company, ClickBuy, and it arrived at my doorstep as if it had come from Melbourne or Adelaide. So, there's a seamlessness there that probably maybe we take for granted. Maybe one of the unsung heroes in the trade relationship across the Tasman is on the services front. I guess intuitively, instinctively, a lot of us in our day-to-day lives don't think of services as exports, but things like tourism, education, transport, Air New Zealand, Qantas, these kind of dominate our trade relationship right now. And they have a sort of multiplying effect across the broader economy as well. So, we might think that I might think that going skiing in New Zealand or Kiwis coming to visit during the summer or whatever, it might not seem like an export, but it is. It's an important one. It's one that drives, jobs and productivity on both sides of the ditch.
Thanks, Jeremy. And just before we get to the next question, a reminder to our viewers to put your questions into the Q&A, and in about 5 or 10 minutes, I'll be putting those to the panelists. You can also get in there and vote on other people's questions. So if there's a particular question you want to see asked, give that a thumbs up, and it becomes more likely to get asked. So this next question to Annette and Jeremy, you gave us a good lead into this before. There's often talk about Australia and New Zealand having shared values, although we do sometimes play different roles in the region and the world. Examples of that might include New Zealand's anti-nuclear policy, and perhaps more recently in terms of the AUKUS deal. But more generally, how should our 2 countries be working together to leverage our different strengths and our shared values in pursuit of peace and stability, especially with new conflicts emerging around the globe at the moment? And I should say, if either of you want to talk about AUKUS, if one of you could give a quick overview of AUKUS. One mistake for ex-diplomats will always make is talking in acronyms.
I think one of the ways that we have made a very good start and are building on it has been working together in the Pacific. And the Pacific is really, and we are a Pacific nation. And so is Australia, in a very large one. But we have been working together and improving our relationship and the way we work with the Pacific Islands, and acknowledging their concerns, which are, number one is climate change and how it's affecting them and their economies and their people. And that's something I think we need to keep building on, keeping them as a major focus between us. We don't always have the funds that Australia have, but often we have relationships that are old relationships. You know, when you consider that Auckland was probably the biggest Pacific Island city in the world. And I think with the relationships and our funding together, that we can really, in the world we're looking at, in our part of the world, that's one area I think that we can certainly keep building on. And we do share a lot of values in terms of what we want for the Pacific. And the only other thing I'd say is that we are together, and Stephen would have experienced this, we are together in many international forums. We work together. And I can recall when I went to the WHA for a number of years as health minister, it was Australia and New Zealand and Sweden and others that was working on the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, for example. And so the big issues at those international forums where we come together because we're like-minded, I think is something that is going to be even more important in this unstable world. There's just a couple of reflections from me.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I would just add, Murray mentioned AUKUS, where, I guess there's a debate playing out right now in New Zealand about whether that's something that New Zealand wants to get part of in the non-nuclear sense of what is a defense technology pact between Australia, the US, and the UK. I guess one of the reasons why those sorts of stories generate so much debate, generate headlines, is because those moments where we might disagree, they're pretty rare. And so, it's only natural that our debate would focus on that. But, I think realistically, the bigger story is one of working very closely together. Maybe I'll offer another example, which is, right now the whole world is trying to grapple with the disruption, whether you love him or otherwise, the disruption of Donald Trump's return to the White House. And one way that disruption is playing out is in the trade front. And we talk about how's Australia responding or how's New Zealand responding. I think even the question of how we're responding, I'd go a little earlier and say that we were very ready for that, because both of us had a realization decades ago in the early 2000s, both New Zealand and Australia, had a realization that the world trading system, the WTO, was coming under a lot of pressure. And the Doha round has been basically in freeze mode since the early 2000s. So both of our countries are now very lucky to have very sharp trade negotiators who have spent the last couple of decades actively working on FTAs, sometimes together, like with ASEAN or RCEP, or TPP, some more acronyms there for everyone. But so as a result, Australia has like 18 FTAs, New Zealand has a similar number covering almost all of our trade, a huge chunk of the world GDP. And so that's an example of where, yes, we kept working together to try and get that trade system through and get some concrete outcomes from the WTO. But at the same time, we just worked together to, find workarounds and find other ways to keep trading with the rest of the world, because that's, like I said before, that's the kind of international system that we both really rely on. We need free trade.
Yeah. Thanks,
I
Jeremy.
certainly agree
Stephen,
with
same
that latter
question to
point.
you. Yeah.
Jeremy. Just a note very briefly, and I think it's worth putting on our agenda, and we'll probably get to this in a moment, but of course, notwithstanding all the things we have in common, we do see the world sometimes in quite different ways. And one of the most particular differences there is between New Zealand and Australia is around the view of the United States. Australia is deeply embedded as an ally of the United States. New Zealand is a very, very, very good friend that we've been trying to build up over a long period of time, to meet our security and also our economic objectives. But you can never, I'm always struck at the difference in tone, though, between commentary about the United States in both countries. And I would add the other one, which of course, we do have slightly different views about China as well. I mean, China, which has underpinned New Zealand's economic transformation, to a certain extent, and in much the same way, actually, that Australia did when we signed CER in '83, and remains critically important to us. Of course, different sets of values and all the rest of it, but those two things do mark some differences between the way we operate, but they don't, again, of course, those differences don't define the relationship.
Thanks, Stephen.
I think just and Jeremy probably comment better on this than me, but there is a changing view of the Australian public towards the United States, and that came through in the latest Lowy poll. You know, they were always right. They were never as high as New Zealand, but they were certainly up there as a very, very good friend, a best friend. But I think, and it's certainly come about since the election of Donald Trump, that the public, now that all in the end plays some into the political system at some point, I think, because of how the public are viewing the changes and the unreliability, as they see, as their very best friend, you know, Australia's very best friend. And as Stephen said, we haven't been that for a long time.
Mm. Mm.
Thanks, Annette. Okay, we're right at audience Q&A time, and the first question today was from Cherry. She asks, how would you describe the difference between the relationships the two countries have with China? We've spent a lot of time talking about Australia and New Zealand's respective relationships with the United States, but a question about China, and I'll put that to all of you. So who wants to take the first shot at that?
Well, I'd say they're both important. No, you go, Stephen. You're the main man for this.
Well, as I said earlier, I think we have slightly different perspectives on China. I mean, in fact, this is a rapidly emerging sort of environment, and it you know, certainly under the a previous Australian government, the difference was becoming quite acute. But yeah, the current government in Australia that's now carrying on, I think we're seeing the relations, the views come a bit closer together. But China is an indispensable partner for New Zealand, our largest trading partner, I mean, all the rest of it. We don't perceive the threat in quite the same way that maybe our friends in Australia do. But of course, there are those differences of values that we have to continue to work on. Bear in mind, of course, China is a very important economic partner for Australia as well. And even during this time of, you know, so-called Chinese coercion against Australia, which was very serious in some sectors, of course, the trade relationship continued to grow. So both of us are trying to find ways of, you know, walking and chewing gum at the same time. And that gives us a lot to talk about, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, China's transformation has been driving our own economic transformation in much the same way. They're our top export destination by far as well. You know, I guess one way you could look at the differences in how our two countries have approached that is it's maybe a question of time. I feel like maybe some of the tensions hit us first during our, you know, for example, under the Turnbull government in Australia. That's when we started to become a little concerned about some of the evidence emerging of, you know, coercion and, you know, undeclared influence operations by China's Communist Party in our country. And that led to some reforms around, you know, foreign interference laws, which were a world first that the Turnbull government pushed through. And then that played out into other instances as well, responding to threats that we were seeing around our telecommunications networks. Yeah, I think fundamentally it comes down to, this is just speaking for myself, but ever since Xi Jinping has come into power, 2012, I think we've seen China change a little in ways that have made us rethink how we approach that relationship. Massive opportunity, indispensable partner, of course, but it comes with risks. And I think we're just trying to navigate those risks very carefully. We see the United States as part of an indispensable part of the region in just the same way. The region has you know, benefited and flourished and prospered off the backing of decades of US active presence in this region. That's, you know, ushered in 3/4 of a century of the Asian peace, is what international relations theorists would call it. It's a remarkable achievement. We've got to hold on to that. But yeah, it's an example of something where we're approaching differently. But I do think we're converging increasingly. It's partly because of electoral changes on our side. You know, when the Albanese government first came into power, did a really good job, not of conceding any of our interests or values, but on stabilizing the relationship, just hitting pause on what was a downward spiral and just rebuilding dialogue and communication with Beijing so that we could work through what are legitimate differences and concerns that we have. But then, you know, we've seen electoral changes on the Kiwi side as well, who are coming in with a different philosophy and, you know, starting to rethink New Zealand's own strategic outlook and whether there's a way to, you know, for example, I understand there's still a debate about whether it's in New Zealand's interest to join the non-nuclear parts of AUKUS. So yeah, I think we're seeing convergence on both sides.
Yeah, I think that we need to understand that what I've learned in Australia, that they perceive a risk in our area, but from China far more than we do from New Zealand. And some of that's geography, of course, and also, you know, interestingly, Albanese's first international visit was to Indonesia. And so building up relationships alongside the very important trading partner of China. But I just get the feeling that we don't always understand how Australia perceives the threat. They've certainly saw the threat in the Solomons and also in PNG. You know, we've seen a little bit with some of the action in the Cook Islands. So I think we don't always understand that they have had, for much longer than us, concern about closer neighbours. And we are, I suppose, protected in many ways by the fact that Australia's ahead of us in geography. So I think that it's very important. Trade is very important for Australia. It's number one, as Jeremy said. And you did see the impact of the coercion that came from China when they, under the previous government, you know, in wine and beef and grain and so on. Although they might not be the biggest things that are exported, you could see how the tap could be turned on and off. And that isn't something that we've experienced to the same extent as Australia.
Yeah, maybe, and just to answer your reflection on, you know, how we see, to use your word, the threat differently. You know, geography may be part of that, but I think just zooming out a little bit more, there are some upstream drivers. I just think, you know, I've mentioned previously how both of our countries, Australia and New Zealand, really depend on laws and rules in institutions, right, to help our world economy function in a way that's predictable and fair and just. And when you see, you know, a major world power dismissing, for example, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, I mean, it's very clear what the maritime boundaries of Philippines are, but sending Chinese Coast Guard vessels in there and fire hosing Marines, I mean, that's, you know, that's pretty unimpressive behavior. And while it might not be our people getting fire hosed on those boats, it's the rules are getting fire hosed that we all depend on. And when you see, you know, sister democracies like Taiwan getting openly intimidated by vast armadas, I mean, this is, you know, yes, we're far away in a distant corner, but the principles that are under pressure, I think, impact us all. And I totally get that we might respond in slightly different ways. But yeah, that's kind of how I see it.
I certainly agree with you, Jeremy, that the principles are incredibly important, and the international order that we've come to rely on, particularly as smaller economies in our case anyway, is paramount. But I just suggest to you that the abuse of the international order is not just a Chinese problem these days. And I feel very much for Australian policymakers right now, because, you know, look at what is happening in the United States and look at the Trump tariffs. Australia is an FTA partner with the United States for 20 years or more. It applies no tariffs to American exports to the United States. It has a trade deficit with the United States. It's a close ally. And look what's happened. They still get 10% like we do. And, you know, when it comes to bullying neighbors and all the rest of it, the whole thing's being redefined. But, you know, the way we choose to react is something we need to determine in our own way. And I guess what is important is that when it comes to Australia and New Zealand, that is something that we want to talk about and coordinate on as much as we can. And we need to appreciate the differences that we each bring, the difference in perspective that we bring to those considerations.
Good point.
So that discussion's taken us nicely into a question Zach Edwards has posed. We've spent a bit of time talking about the the dynamics in the Asia region. Perhaps we could switch to a discussion about the Pacific region. And the question from Zach is, are Australia's and maybe New Zealand's relationships with the Pacific weakening in the face of changing geopolitics, with the Cook Islands pointed to among others? And question asks, what approach in the Pacific should Australia and New Zealand take moving forward? So welcome panelist reflection on the Pacific part of the Asia Pacific region.
Well, yeah, Pacific is part of the world that Australians hold dear and that I hold dear. I started my career there in Fiji with the United Nations. Look, I think the approach that the Albanese government brought in, our Foreign Minister Penny Wong, she immediately prioritized visiting every single Pacific Island country, which is a pretty remarkable logistical feat, given how logistically difficult some of them are. And I just, it was listening first, it was showing respect, it was hearing how can we be, good faith neighbours as Australians, and in your case as Kiwis. I think that's always been a driver, but obviously when you have great power competition, US and China and others sort of competing for influence in some of these countries, I guess it shines a new light on how that plays out. I think fundamentally one of the messages that Pacific Island neighbours have often made is that they're not really interested in picking sides or being asked to pick sides. They're looking for genuine partnership in tackling some of the shared issues that we all have. So I just think that's the way that we should approach all those conversations is from a perspective of partnership, hearing how we can be better neighbours and then acting on it. And so that's less about criticizing how others might be coming into the region and offering partnership, and more about making sure that those Pacific Island neighbours have choice. That there's not only one partner coming in and offering to build infrastructure, but that there are other options. And Kiwis and Australians, we've been doing that together, joint infrastructure investment across the Pacific in a really big way, billions of dollars. So I think the spirit's there. We see eye to eye between New Zealand and Australia on how to lift our game as part of what is undeniably a competition for influence. And I think we're well placed.
I agree with you, Jeremy. I think that Penny Wong did a remarkable job going out and visiting. But then our current Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, has actually done a similar thing. He has, I think, visited every Pacific island now, and perhaps because of his standing in the Pacific, long-term standing in the Pacific, he's been able to make a mark for New Zealand. Although we've had very good relationship, particularly with Polynesia and Fiji, and Australia have always had good relationships with Micronesia. So putting together what we do, that certainly has accelerated since 2020, and I think, and I could see it as High Commissioner, what was being done together in the sharing of information and acknowledging that there is a choice for the Pacific. We're not telling them what they should do and who their choice should be, but presenting ourselves as the choice that they would want to be partners with.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And I think, we are seeing some strains come into our relationships in the Pacific, and it's always good, even for New Zealand and Australia, to take a check on the way we are dealing with our whanaunga, our relations in that part of the world. It's a different way we have to conduct ourselves, maybe, and long may that continue.
Okay, a really interesting question here from Mike Colville. Might be slightly outside some of our panelists' expertise, but I might start with you, Annette, for this one, as you've sat around the cabinet table and no doubt thought about some of these issues. The question is, Mike talks about being a Kiwi in Australia and noticing one of the key differences in approach around reconciliation with First Peoples, and Australia an approach of that area being led by the private sector and traditional owners, whereas in New Zealand the process is led by the government partnering with iwi. And so Mike asks about the strengths and weaknesses of each approach and the long-term implications of each. I wonder, Annette, if you've got any reflections on that.
I think we are very blessed that we were settled with a treaty. And I mean, we've had our difficulties in terms of recognition and recognition of the wrongs But I think since particularly the 1970s, we have spent a lot of time trying to address the wrongs of the past, and the treaty remains, and increasingly, I think, remains a major part of our nationhood. For Australia, I think the fact that they don't have a treaty, and although there have been efforts made, and I even saw the change in the time I was here. When I first came, a welcome to country happened, particularly in Canberra. They were ahead of everybody, but it had developed over time that there'd be a welcome to country done in different ways in different states and in organisations. So I think that because of the treaty, we have had the ability to address a lot of the issues for our Indigenous community. But then we don't have such a widespread, large country with Aboriginal people that are so scattered around Australia, with, I'm told, over 200 different languages. And one of the things I think have pulled New Zealand together is the fact that we have 3 official languages in New Zealand. We have English, Maori, and sign language. And so being able to communicate, language is really important, I think, in terms of relationships. And the fact that we have that, compared to trying to bring together in Australia so many different languages, it's almost an impossibility. But I was fortunate enough to go twice to the big Gama festival up in Arnhem Land, and to see the tremendous leadership that is coming out of the Aboriginal people, that their leadership in terms of their economic leadership, what they're trying to achieve in social policy. I believe that it is better today than when I used to come over here in the 90s and even early 2000s. I don't know what you think, Jeremy, and there's a long way to go, but it certainly is better.
I mean, I would just say amen to everything. I'm a little jealous that you've gone to Gama, which really sounds like a fantastic festival in our Northern Territory, and it's high on my list. That's one of those areas, one of many, where I think we Australians look across at New Zealand and recognize that there's something we can learn from your own experience, even though they're different, different histories and different challenges. It's definitely an area we can learn. In my old Department of Foreign Affairs, our Foreign Service, it was something that I really loved seeing some of those positive changes borne out. We have an Indigenous People's Ambassador now, like an ambassador at large, doing amazing work, participating in those sort of meaningful discussions all around the world about better leveraging Indigenous knowledge and lessons. And just more broadly, we have more Indigenous voices in our foreign policy. We had our first Indigenous ambassador to Denmark a few years ago, Damien Miller, and more rising through the ranks. So yeah, it's a story of there's pain there, but fundamentally, I see a lot of hope that things are on the improve. I got to say as well, I was, as an Australian citizen and as a former Australian diplomat, I was heartbroken that the Voice referendum went the way it did. That it started. There was broad Australian support for that, but then once it became a partisan issue, one of the parties, the Conservative Party, decided to adopt a political strategy opposing it, and I just think it all went downhill from there, which was kind of, it didn't have to go that way. It was a symbolic gesture of grace, and I thought it could have done a great service to our country, bring us together. Hopefully down the track we can try something like that again. But yeah,
I have to say, Jeremy, the one as a political slogan against the Voice, it was one of the best I've ever seen. And the slogan went, "If you don't know, vote no."
Yeah.
So people said, "Oh, well, I don't know what this is all about." Actually, it was very simple. But and so that slogan, "If you don't know, vote no," certainly resonated with a lot of people who were going to make a big effort to find out anyway.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, everyone, I think that's a good point to close what has been a really insightful and compelling webinar, and a really compelling reminder of the closeness of our two countries and the mutual benefit that confers to us from having such a strong, deep, long-standing relationship. So I really want to thank our panelists, Annette, Jeremy, and Stephen, for making time to engage in today's webinar. And thank you all to our viewers for joining. It's a great discussion. We'll be having a number of webinars rolling out over the coming weeks, so please keep an eye on your in your inboxes for that. But for today, just to say harira, thank you so much all for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.